So in this video, we are going to cover the concept of glycolysis, which is a process that happens in cells that breaks down glucose. So why do I have this picture of candy? Well, remember that glucose is a type of sugar, so we are going to be breaking down sugar for energy. And yeah, glycolysis is something that all cells do to break down glucose for energy. So before we get started on the process of glycolysis, I wanted to first explain how energy can be taken out of a molecule. So when we remove electrons from carbon-based molecules, we call this oxidation. So oxidation is the removal of electrons from any molecule, but specifically when we take it from a carbon-based molecule like sugar, we're going to be also usually removing a hydrogen at the same time and or adding an oxygen. So here in this diagram, we've got methane, which is just a very simple carbon-based molecule. So it's got one carbon and four hydrogens. And we can oxidize it to methanol, and that basically just adds an oxygen. We can oxidize it further to formaldehyde, etc. Again, you don't have to memorize this, but this is just an example of us oxidizing a molecule over and over and over again. In this process, we are removing electrons. Usually, when we remove electrons, we are also removing hydrogens, and oftentimes we're also adding oxygen. So that's why the fully oxidized form is going to be carbon dioxide, where, as you can see, there are no more hydrogens, but there are two oxygens. Now, why am I talking about oxidation? Well, while you are oxidizing a carbon-based molecule, you are usually also removing the energy from that molecule because a lot of energy comes from the electrons. And of course, when you remove energy, where does that energy go? Well, we are essentially going to be harvesting this energy, um, and usually this energy is going to be harvested to produce ATP, which is the battery of the cell, right? You can also produce NADH and FADH2, which are the other energy kind of carrying molecules for the cell. But essentially what we're doing is we're sucking the energy out of a carbon-based molecule through oxidation. And so that is what glycolysis is we're going to be oxidizing a molecule to get its energy out. So let's look at what glycolysis is. By the way, the word glyco means sugar and lysis means to break or to split. And so literally what's happening in glycolysis is we're going to split glucose in half. And so glucose is right here. We're going to split it into two. And in the process, we're going to oxidize it and get energy out. So glucose has 6 carbons. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what we're going to do is split it in half. Now, if you split something in half that has 6 carbons, you're going to get two molecules that each have three. 3 plus 3 is 6. Now, this first process actually requires energy. To split glucose, we have to put in some energy, so we're putting in ATP. Now, the molecules that come out of that get oxidized. So these two arrows up here, over here, are showing that the molecules are being oxidized and we're extracting energy, and that's why we're producing ATP and NADH. And so ATP and NADH are made, and then at the very end, you have pyruvate, two molecules of pyruvate. They both have 3 carbons each. So 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. And these are kind of the oxidized forms. And that is essentially what's happening in glycolysis. Let me go into a little bit more detail about what's happening. So again, we are starting off with glucose, okay, and we are going to be using 2 molecules of ATP. So we're putting in energy to split that glucose in half, because splitting a molecule in half obviously is going to take some energy. And so when we split the glucose in half, it will become glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P for short. Now, this first half of glycolysis is what we call the energy investment phase, because we're actually putting in energy before we get energy out. So it is kind of that push to start a reaction. And so we have that energy investment, and then these G3P molecules, we have 2 of them, they're going to be oxidized. And, there's a lot of different reactions that are happening here. I'm not going to go into that much detail, but they basically get oxidized, and they will eventually become pyruvate at the end. Now, during this process, we're going to be producing 2 NADHs, one each. So one on this side and one on this side, so 2 total. we're going to be producing 4 ATP, 2 over here and 2 over here, so 4 total. And just as a reminder, because we had to put in energy in the beginning and we got 4 ATP at the end, we don't say that we made 4 ATP, we only actually made 2 ATP. So it's kind of like when you put money in the bank, let's say you put $5 in the bank, and then next year you take out that $5, but now it's $10 because you gain interest, right? Did you actually make $10? No, you just made $5 based on, an investment, right? So you invested a certain amount of energy and then you get a payoff. The net amount of ATP that we make is only actually 2 because we used up 2 in the beginning and then we got 4 out at the end. So at the end of the day, we really only made 2 ATP. So keep that in mind. All right, so that is essentially glycolysis in a nutshell. By the way, when we are making ATP in glycolysis, we are doing it through something called substrate level phosphorylation. So let's break down this word. Substrate has to do with substrates that are binding to an enzyme, which we learned in a different video. And then phosphorylation just means that a phosphate group is being moved. And so when ATP is being made during the glycolysis process, so I'm talking about the 2 ATP here and the 2 ATP here, that is happening through this process. So the enzymes that are involved bind to a substrate that has a phosphate group, and that phosphate group gets transferred to ADP and converts that ADP into ATP. And so that is essentially what is happening in this last half of glycolysis. And as you can see, that's exactly where that phosphate goes. So as you can see, there's a phosphate here and a phosphate there. That's why that phosphate disappears, because of substrate level phosphorylation. All right, so that is how glucose gets broken down through glycolysis. Now what? Well, glycolysis is actually just the first step in a series of steps that the cell does to extract energy out of glucose. So glucose gets converted into pyruvate and we get some NADH and ATP. In the next couple videos, I will talk about the 2 other steps that happen that also generate energy. So as you can see, more NADH and ATP are produced, and even more ATP are produced in these next 2 steps. So those are going to be explained in another video. All we explained today was just glycolysis. So yeah, hopefully this video was helpful, and I will see you in those next videos.